I stand before you today, not as a man of power, not as a president, not as a soldier in uniform, not as a voice that commands armies or nations, but as a fragile servant who knows with absolute certainty that one day I will stand alone before Allah, stripped of every title, every salute, every applause, every flag that once rose when I entered a room. And in that moment there will be no microphones, no advisors whispering strategy, no crowd cheering or criticizing, only silence so heavy it will crush every excuse I ever told myself. And in that silence, I already feel the weight of a question that burns deeper than fire. What did you do with the trust I placed in your hands? Because leadership on this earth is not a throne of honor. It is a mountain of accountability. And I did not choose this path believing it would end with praise. I chose it knowing it would end with judgment. Because when Allah asks me about the hungry child whose name I never knew, the orphan who slept without protection, the widow who cried in secret, the soldier who followed orders believing I had weighed justice correctly, I will not be able to say I was busy. I will not be able to say the world was complicated. I will not be able to say politics demanded compromise. Because Allah does not judge intentions wrapped in excuses, He judges actions, stripped bare of deception. And I say this today because my heart trembles when I imagine the day when the earth will give up its secrets, when time itself will kneel, when every whisper spoken in darkness will be louder than any speech, delivered in daylight. And I know that power is the most dangerous test Allah gives to a human being because it convinces you that you are in control while silently dragging you toward arrogance. And arrogance is the disease that destroyed kings, tyrants, and empires long before it destroys souls. And I remind myself, every night that Pharaoh did not fall because he lacked intelligence or resources, he fell because he forgot who truly owned authority. And I fear that same forgetting more than I fear enemies, sanctions, or death, because death is a door every soul must walk through, but judgment is a mirror no soul can escape. And when I lower my head in prayer, I do not ask Allah to make me victorious over others. I ask Him to make me victorious over my own ego, because the ego whispers lies that sound like wisdom. It tells you that you deserve more than others, that your sacrifices excuse your mistakes, that your good intentions cancel your failures. But Allah weighs deeds, not narratives, and standing before Him there will be no audience to persuade, no history books to edit, no speeches to rewrite, only a scale so precise that even the weight of an atom will not be overlooked. And I say this because I want those who listen to understand that leadership without fear of Allah is nothing but organized oppression, and strength without humility is merely delayed destruction. And I swear by the nights I could not sleep, by the faces of people who looked at me with hope in their eyes, by the graves of martyrs who will rise before me on the day of judgment, that the thought of standing before Allah frightens me more than bullets or betrayal, because bullets end the body, but accountability questions the soul. And I know that Allah will not ask me how loudly the crowds cheered. He will ask me how quietly I listened to the oppressed. He will not ask me how many speeches I delivered. He will ask me how many prayers I prayed in sincerity when no one was watching. He will not ask me how strong my enemies were. He will ask me how just I was when I had the power to crush them. And sometimes I sit alone and imagine that moment when my deeds will be unfolded, not as stories but as realities, when intentions will be tested against outcomes, when every decision I signed will speak for itself. And in that vision I see that leadership is not about standing above people. It is about standing between Allah and responsibility, knowing that every order given, every silence maintained, every delay tolerated will echo beyond the grave. And I remind myself again and again that Allah does not need my strength, my intelligence, or my strategies. He needs my sincerity, my humility, and my obedience. Because victory comes from Him and failure is allowed by Him as a lesson. And if I forget this truth, then I have already lost even if the world calls me successful. Because success without Allah's acceptance is nothing but decorated loss. And I say all this not to appear righteous, but to confess fear. Because fear of Allah is not weakness, it is clarity. It is the light that prevents a leader from becoming a tyrant. And when I imagine standing before Allah with nothing but my deeds, I pray that He sees a man who tried, who stumbled but repented, who erred but corrected, who never sold justice for comfort, who never chose silence over truth when the cost was heavy. And I pray that when my tongue is sealed and my limbs testify, they speak of a heart that trembled at His name. Because on that day no army will stand behind me, no nation will shield me, no ideology will save me. Only Allah's mercy will matter, and mercy is not demanded. It is earned through humility, sincerity, and fear. And this fear is what keeps me awake, what keeps me grounded, what keeps me reminding myself that power is temporary, but judgment is eternal. And when that fear grips my chest, it does not paralyze me, it sharpens me. Because a leader who fears Allah walks carefully on the earth, knowing that every footprint is recorded. And I have learned that injustice does not always arrive wearing the face of crew. LTY, sometimes it arrives wearing the mask of necessity. Sometimes it whispers that there is no alternative. Sometimes it tells you to delay truth for the sake of stability. But Allah does not accept delayed justice when immediate justice was possible. And this is the burden that sits on my shoulders heavier than any uniform, because I know that Allah will not ask me what others forced me to do. He will ask me what I chose to do when the choice was difficult. And I have come to understand that leadership is not proven in moments of applause, but in moments of isolation, when no one is watching, when no one is recording, when no one will ever know why you chose restraint over revenge, mercy over brutality, patience over pride. And I often imagine that day when my excuses will evaporate like mist under the sun, when I will try to explain the pressure, the threats, the complexity, and realize that Allah already knew all of it before it happened. Because nothing surprises Him, and that realization humbles me deeply. Because if Allah already knew every difficulty I would face and still entrusted me with responsibility, then the responsibility itself is proof that excuses will not be accepted. And this is why I constantly remind myself that authority is not ownership, it is custody, and a custodian who abuses trust will face consequences far greater than a thief, because a thief steals without permission. But a corrupt leader steals while claiming legitimacy, and that betrayal cuts deeper in the sight of Allah. And I say this knowing that power can intoxicate even the most sincere heart, if it is not disciplined by remembrance, because remembrance anchors the soul when ambition tries to drag it away. And there are nights when I place my head on the ground and ask Allah not to let me die while injustice still clings to my hands, because dying with unresolved dhulm is a terror no believer should feel comfortable carrying. And when I think of the Day of Judgment, I do not imagine it as a distant event. I imagine it as a meeting already scheduled, a meeting whose date is hidden but whose certainty is absolute. And in that meeting, Allah will not ask me how strong my speeches were. He will ask me how strong my patience was. He will not ask me how loud my supporters were. He will ask me how silent I was in prayer when fear overcame me. He will not ask me how many enemies I defeated. He will ask me how many hearts I protected from harm. Because power that crushes souls may win territory, but it loses eternity. And eternity is the only real success. And this understanding reshaped how I see leadership, because leadership without accountability to Allah is nothing but domination. And domination always collapses under its own weight. While leadership rooted in fear of Allah builds quietly, patiently, enduringly, and I remind myself that Allah does not rush, but He never forgets, and that delay in justice is not denial of justice. It is a test of patience for the oppressed, and a trap of false security for the oppressor. And I fear becoming comfortable in a position that Allah intended to be uncomfortable. Because comfort dulls conscience, and a dull conscience is the first step toward corruption. And when I imagine standing before Allah and seeing the faces of those affected by my decisions standing behind me as witnesses, my heart trembles, because no argument is stronger than lived consequences, and I know that Allah will allow them to speak, and their silence or their testimony will weigh heavier than any words I could offer. And this is why I try to remind myself daily that justice is not a slogan, it is a discipline. It requires consistency when emotions fluctuate. It requires courage when pressure mounts. And it requires humility when success tempts. Arrogance, and I have learned that the greatest danger to a leader is not rebellion or opposition, it is self-deception. Because a leader who deceives himself can justify anything, but Allah is not deceived. And the Quran does not bend to ambition, and the scale on the Day of Judgment does not tilt in favor of power. And I say this with full awareness that my intentions alone will not save me if my actions contradict them. Because sincerity without alignment is incomplete. And alignment without sincerity is hypocrisy. And Allah accepts neither. And when I picture that moment of standing before Him, barefoot, unarmed, unnamed, I realize how small every worldly conflict truly is, how insignificant every insult becomes, how meaningless every temporary victory appears, and that realization strips anger from my heart and replaces it with responsibility. Because anger blinds, but responsibility clarifies. And I want to stand before Allah not claiming perfection, but presenting effort, not claiming innocence but presenting repentance, not claiming greatness but presenting humility. And I pray that when Allah asks me about leadership, I can answer that I feared Him more than I feared losing position, more than I feared criticism, more than I feared isolation, because leadership ends, life ends, history fades, but Allah remains and the soul returns only to Him. And when I think of that return to Allah, I realize that every moment of authority is actually a countdown, not toward legacy but toward accountability, because legacy lives in people's memories while accountability lives in Allah's record. And memories can be manipulated but records cannot, and this truth forces me to ask myself questions that are uncomfortable but necessary. Questions like whether I ever chose ease over equity, whether I ever allowed fear to delay justice, whether I ever mistook loyalty for righteousness. Because Allah does not measure loyalty to individuals, He measures loyalty to principles. And the greatest test of leadership is not how fiercely one defends allies, but how fairly one treats even those who oppose Him. And I know that on the day of judgment, Allah will not ask me whether my decisions were popular. He will ask me whether they were just, because popularity is a currency of this world while justice is a requirement of the next. And I often remind myself that even a ruler who prays, fasts, and speaks of faith will be questioned harshly if he wronged people under his authority, because worship that does not restrain injustice is incomplete, and remembrance that does not soften the heart is hollow. And when I imagine standing before Allah while those I govern stand beside me, I understand that leadership multiplies deeds, both good and bad, because a single decision can benefit millions or harm generations. And this multiplication terrifies me, because it means that negligence is not neutral, it is destructive, and silence in the face of wrongdoing is not patience, it is participation. And I do not want to stand before Allah carrying the weight of harm I could have prevented, but chose not to. And this is why I try to remember that Allah does not need leaders to be flawless. He needs them to be accountable, to return, to correct, to seek forgiveness, because arrogance blocks repentance, while humility invites mercy. And mercy is what every leader will desperately need when standing before Allah. And sometimes I imagine that moment when my mouth will be sealed and my hands will speak, when my feet will testify where they walked, and my eyes will testify what they overlooked. And I ask myself whether my eyes looked away from suffering because it was inconvenient, whether my hand signed papers without fully considering the human cost. Because on that day, intentions will not erase consequences, and regret will not reverse damage. And this realization humbles me deeply, because it reminds me that leadership is not about control, but about stewardship. And a steward who betrays trust cannot claim ignorance. And I also remind myself that Allah is perfectly just, but He is also perfectly merciful. And mercy is not random. It descends upon hearts that remain aware of Him, that fear Him privately, that correct themselves before they are corrected publicly. And this is why I do not glorify myself when people praise me, because praise is a test, just like criticism, and both can distract the heart from Allah if they are not handled with discipline. And I have learned that a leader who begins to believe his own image has already begun to fall, even if the fall has not yet appeared, because arrogance is always followed by humiliation, either in this world or the next. And I would rather be humbled here through reminders than be humiliated there through exposure. And I say this because standing before Allah is not a metaphor to me. It is a certainty that shapes how I think, how I decide, how I restrain myself when anger rises, because anger feels powerful in the moment but leaves scars that outlive its justification. And Allah will ask about those scars, not the emotions that caused them. And I want to stand before Him knowing that I struggled against my anger instead of surrendering to it, that I chose patience even when it cost me strength in the eyes of people, because Allah's standard is not human perception. And when I imagine that final standing, I do not imagine fear alone, I also imagine hope, because Allah is Al-Adl, but He is also Ar-Rahman. And hope balanced with fear is what keeps the heart upright. And I pray that Allah sees in my record a pattern of striving, not perfection, a pattern of returning, not persistence in error. A pattern of humility, not entitlement, because entitlement is the language of those who forget Allah, and remembrance is the language of those who survive power without being consumed by it. And I know that when I finally stand before Allah, no one will ask me who I was on earth. They will only ask who I was in truth. And that truth is what I am preparing for every single day.